Let me introduce Glenn Diesen from the University. From the University of Southeastern Norway. And Mr. Arne Ruth. Many of you know Arne, the former editor-in-chief of Dagens Nyheter, a major newspaper in Sweden, and we're so honored that he was able to come all the way from Stockholm today to visit with us and participate in this panel debate. Thank you very much, Arne. I just wanted to say, yes, of course, please. I just wanted to say one more thing, and I will have some, you'll have to suffer a couple of concluding remarks from me at the end as well, but I wanted to thank Fritt Ord, who has been a sponsor for this event. Now, Fritt Ord means free word, and they have a long history in Norway to support freedom of speech. And I think that, in essence, this is what good dialogue between people requires. We need the opportunity to speak freely. Censorship is a way to put a munkurv on people. It is the fundamental right of a human to speak freely. It is that fundamental right on which all our other rights are based. So I just wanted to say that, and that we have had a fantastic speeches from our three speakers, and now we will continue in that fashion of dialogue and making each other aware through Fritt Ord. Tack. Glenn, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Well, my first thoughts was just some comments on what Mattias was speaking of, because on propaganda, it's often treated as almost now as a way of censoring people. So if you're a propagandist, you're saying the wrong thing. It's used a bit too loosely and always with a purpose. But I found it interesting because behind propaganda there is essentially a full social science behind it, which also taps into the psychology, which is the whole idea from Sigmund Freud, the group psychology, which overrides the rational individual. So you might be an individual who can make rational thinking, but once you dive into the group psychology, this is all overridden. And of course, this really kicks in when you have an external fear. This is when the individual struggles to think on their own, which is why I thought it was quite interesting, this the comments you made from Russiagate to COVID and now the Russian invasion. We never really had a break for a decade now. So people, I think, is part of the reason why they're losing their mind. But within the group psychology, a key aspect is this: we divide ourselves into in-groups and out-groups. And this is where Freud's nephew comes in, Edward Bernays. And he uses this for political propaganda. He writes some of the best literature there is on political propaganda. Goebbels himself referred to Bernays. So this is the real propaganda. So again, you say this is good versus evil, and then you assign different values. So in the West now we say everything is about liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. Doesn't matter where there's a conflict in the world. You might not heard of the name before, don't know where it is on the map, but you know exactly who's the good guy and the bad guy and who to cheer for. And this is propaganda. People don't always pick up on it. And what it also makes it impossible to do is to go against the group, because it's quite treasonous. Again, you might not know anything about the conflict, but you know that you have to support your own. And again, this is the tribal instinct. And with this, all hate, everything is virtuous, because if you hate your opponents because you're good, they're bad. And from this, you can say the most vile thing, and you see this in the media now. There's nothing you can't say which is vile enough, and it's always, dressed up in morality. And this is Orwell's 2 minutes of hate we have almost on a daily basis now. And this is what undermines the rational thinking, at least from my perspective, and that's why I also liked your comment on your glasses, because that also made me think about the lenses, because this is when propaganda really kicked in. About a century ago, this is when Lippmann, Bernays came out, and their whole argument was the world becomes more complex. People need simplify the heuristics, that is to put on a lens to interpret everything, and that's the role of propaganda. You give the lens, you tell them exactly how to interpret any conflict in the world. So if you look at Middle East, well, you have barbaric, terrorists, rapists, baby killers, and then you have the noble liberal democracy, the shining hope of the region. And after this, nothing. Facts don't matter anymore. If you ever, the U.S. invades a country, at least you're building democracy and civilization. If their opponents will do the exact same, well, it's imperialism, barbarity, the destruction of international law. So facts don't matter anymore once you put on this, glasses you referred to. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded. But just some thoughts. I thought, did you delve into some of the? You couldn't go through everything. The Freudian ideas behind this.
I was trained as a Freudian and a Lacanian psychoanalyst, so I do definitely, yes. And that's one of the major conclusions, I believe, of every more or less serious analysis of what happens in this era. One of the major conclusions is that it demonstrates us a repressed truth of the Enlightenment tradition. The Enlightenment tradition believed that the human being is a rational human being, and that society should be led on the basis of rational thinking. And what happens now, what happened in the totalitarian states, demonstrates us in a mind-boggling way that it is exactly the opposite. We are not rational human beings. We are in the first place human beings that need to deal with their emotions, anxiety, frustration, aggression, and the one who tells us how we can deal with them is the master of the world. And what the rational qualities are, or how rational the narratives are that people spread, doesn't matter if the narrative that is spread provides someone with an object of anxiety, an object of frustration, an object of aggression, something that can make us control our emotions. We will follow it. We are all irrational beings, not only the people in the masses or the people who fall prey to propaganda, us as well. So we have to know that the first choice we have to make in our life, the most fundamental and the most important choice we can make is the choice at the level of our emotions. What will we follow? Will we follow hate or will we follow love? That's ultimately what matters. Also, it's not because we do not fall prey to a corona mass formation or a Ukraine mass formation that we might not fall prey to a different mass formation which also leads us into hate. So I think that's a responsibility we all have. Our first and most important responsibility, I believe, is what choice will we make at the level of our emotions?
Well, I was wondering, Aaron, if you had any similar thoughts on it, because actually last week I spoke with Gideon Levy, an Israeli journalist, and a lot of interesting things he came with. But the most important thing, at least for me on this topic, was he was pointing out how all his fellow citizens in Israel, that they were all convinced that almost a siege mentality, that whatever they did, it was all justified because their opponents were, they're all evil, they want to get them, and almost immune to criticism, because if there's some criticism from, even allies, it's because, they're after you, they're there to get you. Is this also something you look into?
Let me first, since Yves held you to account as the people of Norway for producing Jens Stoltenberg, let me compliment you for producing Glenn Diesen. I can't tell you, I can't. I can't tell you how good he's been, not only for the image of Norway, but for all of Western Europe. The fact that you produced at least one sensible, brave academic on the issue of Ukraine after everybody fell in line to, repeat proxy war propaganda. So, Glenn, thank you for all you do. I know it's not easy in your position, taking the stances you take and bringing the facts that you bring to the public and working very hard to bring. So thank you for all you do. It's great to be here with you. On the issue of Israel, I wish I had the psychological insight to figure out Israel. I've lived there for a bit. I spent some time there. That was over 20 years ago, and the country's gotten way more extreme than it used to be. One of the few countries in the world where the younger generation is even more extreme than the older generation. How does that happen? Usually, the youth are more progressive and liberal, but that doesn't happen in Israel. It's just years of being an ethno-supremacist state, years of living in denial, not willing to acknowledge the Nakba, the foundational crime that created Israel, the foundational fact that this was not an empty land, but a land full of people that were ethnically cleansed. And when you're premised on denial, when you're premised on ethnic cleansing, and you're just so committed to continuing that project, it's going to take a deep psychological toll that I just can't possibly comprehend. And I think that's what explains this Israeli mentality on some level to justify all the horrors, all the evil, all the supremacy that's just embedded in that society. You have to constantly think that you live in fear. And I know that, for Nazis, there's some overlap there. There was this idea that, they all want to destroy our way of life, and therefore we have to wipe them out. So, but it would take years for me to study the Israeli mentality and understand it. It's just it's so extreme in its cruelty. I mean, the majority of the country doesn't support even letting aid into Gaza. I mean, how do you have that? What kind of a society is this? It's to me today, it's a level of evil that I don't think exists anywhere else. I'm sorry to say.
Well, I'll just make one quick comment and I'll stop hogging the stage. Just one thing that I picked up on what you said, which I thought was very excellent. This whole idea that, propaganda to a large extent, it appeals to the best in human nature, your compassion for others, but it is used instrumentally to do the worst. And of course, you refer to the issue in Gaza. There is, you refer to the dead babies, even though it didn't happen, the raped women, and of course everyone has compassion, and then you use this to excuse, for example, genocide. And sometimes you do have evidence which comes forward. For example, the Afghanistan issue. That is, I think it was WikiLeaks who leaked a report from the CIA in which they noted that in Afghanistan, the Europeans were losing interest in the war. That is, the occupation had been going on for too long. They're losing interest. So again, they recommended, how about we, frame it more in the terms of, women's rights. Little girls going to school. Who doesn't want little girls going to school? So, unless you're for the occupation, then you're against little girls being able to go to school. And then suddenly, shortly after, you have people like. Actually, Jens Stoltenberg, sorry, bring him up again, with Angelina Jolie to give some Hollywood flavor into it. They write articles together in Guardian. How about NATO is now the main promoter of women's rights? And again, people buy it because they want to buy it. We all want to do good. We all care about the women in Afghanistan. It's not as if they weren't suffering, but the whole idea behind it, that the United States, the main hegemon in the world, whose security strategy is premised on the idea that they have to dominate the world for security, that their role in this key area of Central Asia is to let little girls go to school. This is why you occupy a country for 20 years. I mean, it is ridiculous that people do believe this, but most people would, because you want to believe it, because you want to be good.
There's one aspect that I didn't mention that I want to about Israel, which is that the crimes are so severe and the propaganda just simply hasn't worked, because everyone can see now this live stream genocide just on our phones, that they've had to resort not only to propaganda but to outright, unprecedented in my lifetime, censorship, in the US especially, where students are being deported, kidnapped from the streets for signing op-eds against the genocide. There's a huge pressure campaign to cancel people. There's even recently a campaign, I don't know if you've ever heard of Miss Rachel, but she's a very popular YouTube kids entertainer, makes videos aimed at young children. And she made the mistake of talking about the children of Gaza, right? And even speaking to one young child from Gaza on her show who had her legs amputated. And so Miss Rachel, who's very beloved by kids around the country, she's facing a cancellation campaign, not only from right-wing media like Fox News, but the New York Times had a hit piece on her. And the subheadline was, Miss Rachel has come under criticism for highlighting the plight of Gaza children too much on her social media feed, as if you have to now defend highlighting the plight of children on your social media feed. And I swear to God, this is not a joke. Some anonymous Stop Anti-Semitism group, which nobody, is anonymous and it's a fake group, they came out and said she must be paid by Hamas, right? Because why else would you talk about the children of Gaza unless you were paid by Hamas? And of course, never mind, how is possibly Hamas going to get money to a YouTube star in the U.S.? And why would she need to take money from Hamas? Anyway, they accused, it doesn't matter, they accused her of Hamas. And so the New York Times asked her, are you paid by Hamas? And she wrote, and they wrote, Miss Rachel denied being paid by Hamas, which is just amazing journalism to find out whether Miss Rachel is being paid by Hamas. But that's how ridiculous it's getting, where they're having to censor people, kidnap them, deport them, and if you can't deport them, accuse them of being paid by Hamas, even if they're a beloved children's star.
Can I? Yes. Aaron, while I acknowledge the cruelties you describe, I wonder, but would you think they are more cruel than, let's say, what the Zelensky regime did in eastern Ukraine, or what Muslims do among each other, or what in so many places in the world happens? It's just a question that I had when you were talking as well. What for you makes the cruelty in Israel so particular? So, do you really consider it worse than the cruelties somewhere else in the world?
Well, listen, maybe I'm biased. I'm very close to this issue. I'm Jewish myself. I feel guilt that this is being done in my name. I've been involved with it for a very long time. But yeah, I do. I mean, because this is a long-running ethnic cleansing campaign, and the people of Gaza, unlike the people in the Donbass, for example, they can't defend themselves, and they're trapped. They can't go anywhere. They're in a death camp. It's a giant concentration camp, as even Israeli officials have admitted. And yeah, to me, it is one of the worst crimes in human history. Subjecting 2 million defenseless, trapped people to a 1.5 year long mass murder campaign. To me, and you're right, I'm on top of every other conflict. I know that in the Sudan, there's a massive humanitarian crisis, but in terms of the level of evil, of cynicism, of deception, of lying to the public, of the perpetrator claiming that they're the victims while they're inflicting just horrific crimes on a civilian population of mostly children that can't flee, yeah, I think it's one of the worst crimes in human history.
Can I one more thing? But for instance, I'm a Belgian, and we Belgians killed probably about 20 million people in Congo. We killed them just to bring the rubber and some other stuff from Congo to here. I think in a certain way maybe it's important to sometimes just take the perspective that cruelty, hate, just exists in every human's heart, as Solzhenitsyn said, and that maybe it's worse in one country than in another from time to time. Okay, I agree with that, but I think we shouldn't just lose the major focus, which always should be, I think, this problematic characteristic of human nature, which is that we believe that another human being is not another human being anymore. I think that's the basis, and that doesn't take away that we have to speak out when cruelties happen in an as sincere way as possible, but also using the ethical and moral measurement stick more or less in an equal way. I think it's important that we use the same norm and ethical and moral norm everywhere a little bit similar. I think that's just important, or otherwise inevitably certain people will feel that they are targeted more than other people.
Yeah, I need to respond. It's simple facts, right? Like how many reporters have been killed in Gaza? It's like all the reporters in war zones have been killed in the last 19 months equals to like the last 100 years. You look at the facts on the proportion of bombs dropped per square kilometer, and it's like 100 times what the U.S. did in Vietnam. If you look at the number of civilians, the number of children killed, what's gone on in Donbass is not
I
even...
doubt that. 100 times more than in Vietnam?
Yeah, of course.
Do you know what happened in Vietnam?
Of course, there was 4 million people killed. But
I would
look at
like
the
to
size.
see
Look
that
at
figures.
no, but you can look them up. It's not. This is not up.
I will.
It's not up for by any serious look at metrics of civilians killed. I mean, look at how many civilians have been killed in Ukraine. It's nothing comparable to what Israel's done in Gaza. And then you bring the broader context of it's everyone. 2/3 of people who live in Gaza were driven from their homes. Their homes are literally like 10 kilometers away, and they've never been able to cross that fence until October 7th. That's the reality of it. Now, and then the as important point in all that is that I wanted to bring this point up with regards to the discussion I didn't, which is real internationalism is nationalist. Okay, so it's about what your government, your political culture's crimes, what they're responsible for. In Sudan, there's clearly, there's starvation in Sudan. There's 2 warring sides that have killed many, and it's huge amounts of displacement. More displacement, obviously, than in Gaza because they can't leave in Gaza. But what's the Canadian government? What's the Norwegian government's role? Does anyone have any problem saying any wildly negative thing about what's going on in Sudan? No, because we're not supporting it. We're not part of it. There's tangential things here and there. UAE, we have some support for UAE, and UAE is providing some weapons to the RSF, and the RSF is even worse than the Sudan military, and you can get into some of those things. But it's really important to not only, like I said, the metrics with Gaza are unique, but also the responsibility for the crime is very much in our hands. And so our ability to change what's happening, our ability to change what's happening in Sudan is just tangential. Whereas in Gaza, it's not tangential. We're at the center of it. And that's why I focus on Canada's complicity in Israel's crimes. And Norway's complicity is not as extensive as Canadian, and Canadian's not as extensive as the U.S. But why is there still an Israeli ambassador in here? Why hasn't the Israeli ambassador been expelled? Right? Like, there's all kinds of ways, I'm sure. Right? So I think that yeah, and yeah.
Arne?
Well, Israel is certainly a very explicit example of total collapse of human rights. But is it exceptional in the sense that something like that doesn't happen anywhere else? In my opinion, any nation state can go into that condition. And if I take my own country, Sweden, there is an economic aspect to the downfall of democracy in Sweden. Sweden has more billionaires as a percentage of the population than the United States. Think of that. And think of Marx. In my opinion, a revival of Marxist perspectives on capitalism is the only way of not using his recommendations in terms of what kind of political action, but his moral perspective on capitalism is necessary. Because if you have a country which has the size of Sweden, with a number of dollar billionaires, I'm not talking about billionaires in terms of kronor, then something with that social setting will break down. And what does it mean? There are poor people in Sweden. Why should they be satisfied with being citizens or if they're not citizens, people are living there on mercy, immigrants coming, refugees coming. Why should they be content? Why shouldn't they start acting? So why do right-wing populist parties win? They win because they say something which seems to be contrary to the logic of material privileges. Why do young men who live in the suburbs of Stockholm buy Rolex clocks? Because, like rich people who drive Jaguars or even Rolls Royces, they want to show off. I would say that Norway is a very strange example of economic perplexity. Oil funds. Oil funds, oil funds. What does it mean? You've been exploiting oil, which is a major element of climate change. Why don't you invest all of the funds into making real measures against climate change, like investing them? Thus, economy is the question of morals. And capitalism itself, the market economy, as defined by the originators of it, was based on the idea that you could trust. You have made a barter, a deal, and you could trust that it was fulfilled. You had a law system which was seemed to guarantee that. And we don't have that. And that's my last question now. What do we do about inequality in nation states?
Expropriate the expropriators.
Yes. And how do we do that?
I mean, you do that through working class struggle, be it expanding union rights, be it getting more say within companies, unfortunately, I would say through revolution usually, but ideally through reform. But
I can just tell you that living in the U.S., this Trump thing is a real problem because he does have a massive following of people who really do believe that he's looking out for them, right? He's exploited their grievances and he's going to drain the swamp, even as he makes the swamp a lot bigger with a cabinet of billionaires. But nothing he does can shake their faith in him. And I don't know what the answer is there. I mean, and what he does is he successfully demonizes undocumented immigrants for the economic problems that people have, even as his policies actually create many undocumented immigrants. So, for example, in his first term, he tried to launch a coup in Venezuela and install a puppet government, and he was warned, and we know this from reporting that's come out. If you do this, if you try to destroy the country with sanctions, is this working? If you do this and you try to destroy the country with sanctions, it's going to create millions of migrants, and he did it anyway. And then he goes ahead and then campaigns against the very migrants that he creates. But it works, and so all the anger over the economic system, people feeling left out, no opportunities, no health care, which is a major problem in the U.S., all that gets channeled into this cult, into this populism. And he also successfully exploits the fact that our rulers have long time brought us into war, and he claims he's going to take on the deep state. He uses the word neocons pejoratively, which people love, even though meanwhile he pursues neocon policies, a lot of them. So it's a tough one. I don't have the answer. I'm just saying it's a serious problem.
I also want to try to say something about your question. What can we do about the inequality between people? I think in the first place, I don't know if everyone has to be exactly equal. I believe Nietzsche was right there. We don't have to be exactly equal, also not at the economic level, in my opinion. But the excesses of capitalism have to disappear, and I think there is only one real way, or at least the most important thing I believe is to stop winning money out of money. Like interest should be forbidden. And that's the Muslim world has the right principle there. It's a very important one. That is the first thing. I think that's the first step. Like the banking system is completely perverted. And it's the banking system that buys the Congress in America, and the Congress in America votes these stupid laws which protect the banking system, makes them even richer, and the military apparatus comes in, and in the end you have these stupid regime change wars like in Syria, Libya, the fact that Israel will attack Iran now, in probably, or the United States will do it. So, but it starts somewhere, I believe, with a perversion at the level of money, which in its turn maybe is actually just one aspect of the perversion of the use of words. We stopped, in a strange way, our Enlightenment culture, while it believed that it found the highway to truth, got completely alienated from truth. I think that's the basis of the biggest problem, the most fundamental problem.
One more comment. Another obstacle to tackling inequality is that if you're a political party or politician who's serious about tackling inequality, you're going to be smeared by the media and the establishment. You'll be called, for example, a Russian asset, as I know is happening to a new political party here that stands for peace and justice. That's what happened to Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. Jeremy Corbyn was so close to becoming UK Prime Minister. He was within a few thousand votes. People within his own party helped sabotage him. And he also was the target of this complete scam of being accused of presiding over an anti-Semitism crisis inside the Labour Party. And everyone was an anti-Semite now because of him. And it was a complete fabrication by the Israel lobby and its allies in the corporate media, not only because he was critical of Israel, but because he actually was a politician who stood for tackling inequality. And Bernie Sanders faced a similar thing in the U.S., where in the U.S. in 2020, when Bernie Sanders was challenging Joe Biden in the primary, the establishment dusted off the Russiagate playbook, which they had used against Donald Trump. And they used it against Trump for many reasons, including that not because Donald Trump is a progressive who's going to take on inequality, but because they didn't see him as a suitable steward, a suitable manager of the global U.S. empire. So they accused him of being a Russian agent. And when Bernie Sanders came back in 2020, they used that against him because Bernie Sanders also was seen as a threat to the establishment and accused him of being a Russian agent. And Bernie Sanders, unfortunately, didn't have the political fortitude to call it out as a scam. He actually accepted it and played along with it. And that's why that's part of the reason why he's not the leader. But that's another thing that happens is when you're a genuine challenge to the establishment, you face a barrage of propaganda and defamation.
Oh, sure. Well, I think, some of the problems, at least inability to resolve some of the issues, economic as well as social, is, as everyone here alluded to, especially Aaron, the idea that society is polarizing itself. And I think this is also a common phenomenon you see when there's too much antagonism towards external forces. Because, again, we all in human nature tend to identify or again split into in-group versus out-group. Usually this takes the form in-grouping represented by the nation. Now you see when there's a great hostility towards an out-group, for example, in the beginning of the 20th century, the British, they feared Soviet communism, and then the hatred builds up. And then you can, of course, assign the out-group to your own political opposition, which is what they did in the 1920s. The labor movement came up. You had some, pushing for more, equal rights for workers, better pay. What did they do? They say, well, they're working with the Bolsheviks. They create this fake letter, that they're working with the Soviets to undermine British security, and they get smeared, and they didn't recover. At least for a few decades. So this is a huge problem, and I would also put that on Russiagate, because you have this huge, they tried to sink Trump's first presidency. They couldn't do it in any way. For some, as he said, you can shoot someone in Manhattan, he gets away with it, and so they made him then a Russian agent effectively, which is silly. Then you had. They could blame him also for this Biden laptop. Again, there was no evidence, nothing made sense. But this is what happens in society. If you then begin to call people within your own society being part of the outgroup, then you polarize. And it's not just that you hate the other part of your society, it's also once society polarizes, you also have more incentive to excuse what your own group are doing. So if you're, let's say, on the political right in the United States now, and Trump, he's going to stop the illegal immigration. Yes, I'm for it. He's going to bring back jobs. I'm for it. Are we going to deport some Muslims? Yeah. Like you have to get on board on all of this because you have to support your own. And I think this is the dangerous part. You make excuses for your own, and you see this in war situations. Anything you see BS reasons coming from your own leaders, and you have to accept them. This is how you display group loyalty, just like you have to hate your opponent. So I think towards this end, I think it's very difficult to resolve any economic inequalities as long as people fall into this polarization.
Russiagate was such a disaster for the world, for a progressive cause, because people were so afraid of Trump on the liberal side. And because Trump was framed as a product and an agent of Russia, this meant that anything done by the establishment in the name of countering Russia was sold to the public as also a way to counter Trump, which meant that for progressives who are supposed to be for social spending and not spending on the military-industrial complex, when Joe Biden came along and said, hey, I need over $150 billion for the Ukraine proxy war, every single progressive lawmaker in the U.S. Congress, including Bernie Sanders, a lifelong peace advocate, hippie, whatever you want to call him, all lined up to give Joe Biden and and Lockheed Martin and Boeing tens of billions of dollars to fund the Ukraine proxy war. And when some progressives, a handful of progressives, wrote a letter in the fall of 2022 to Biden saying, hey, since we're spending so much money on the Ukraine war, can we also use our leverage to negotiate with Russia and end the war? Okay, that was the letter. It's a very mild letter, politely asking Joe Biden that, hey, while we're fighting this proxy war with Russia, can we also maybe start negotiating with Russia too to end the war? And within 24 hours of just, them being accused of being Russian assets and in line with Trump because Trump was associated with Russia, they withdrew the letter. They couldn't even stand behind a very meek, polite call for diplomacy with Russia. And even when that same month, and Glenn, you'll remember this, the top U.S. military officer in the U.S., Mark Milley, he came out and said, let's negotiate with Russia. The top military officer. Even that wasn't enough for the progressives to actually say, yeah, our letter was right. Like, we want peace, we want negotiations, because just the psychological pull and the fear of being accused of being somehow in league with Russia and therefore Trump was so strong that they couldn't even stand behind a call for diplomacy, while also funding the very same military-industrial complex that they all claim to oppose.
Norway has a few days ago celebrated its National Day, the 17th of May. And what is it that Norway commemorates? It's its constitution. The core of Norway in terms of pride is the constitution from 1814. Now, I've been a visiting professor in German journalism and freedom of expression in several countries. And I usually start to ask my students, what do they know about their constitution? How much do you know about it? And usually they know very, very little. They don't understand that freedom of expression without a basic knowledge of citizens of the Constitution is certainly not safe. And you cannot have a discussion about it. So the question now is really, for me, what should we do about this? Each country has its constitution, and they are not similar. There are divergences even in so-called democracies, and I don't have to discuss Britain, which is a very particular case. There is no constitution in formal terms. What is it then? what should one do in relation to media if constitution is a sort of vague, nebulous term? In my opinion, if constitutional rights are not very well known, then any country can become Israel. Do any of you have a response to that, or making an unfair comment?
I don't know enough about the Norwegian constitution.
No, but I'm talking about it in general terms.
Yeah, I mean,
Institutions in general.
yeah, in the Canadian context, I mean, in response to the protests against the genocide in Gaza, there's a whole effort to basically attack the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees freedom of assembly, and there has been a pro-Canadian Charter of Rights or Freedoms organization set up, kind of coalition in Toronto, to push back against the most aggressive push, and that's, I think, important. There's problems with Canada's charter, but there's, in this case, it clearly would be a step backwards to repress right to challenge genocide. But yeah, I mean, I think the legalistic side is important. But I would go back to a bit of your initial question around inequality. I mean, we need to have political movements, political organizations, social movements that are challenging capitalism and putting forward alternatives to this current economic model, and I think the alternative should be basically structured around economic democracy, partly as a sort of way of just framing, but we need to basically say that you don't have democracy if you don't have some democracy in the economic sphere. You can have certain political rights, and we don't want to go backwards on those political rights. We want to expand upon the democratic sphere to also have it in the economic sphere, and more broadly cultural and other spheres. So I think that's a kind of, it needs to be central rather than more sort of legalistic education around specifics in the Constitution.
Thank you very much, Yves, for that last comment. We are nearing the end. However, we do have now some time, and this was courtesy of Aaron, who had decided maybe we shouldn't each speak for 30 minutes at the beginning, but maybe a little shorter, to allow for time for a couple of questions from the audience, and then we can call it a night. So if you give John your hand, I see somebody at the left there, had a woman along the... we won't...
Let's definitely hear from a woman first, because we represented the male population.
Yeah, I think so. This is a very male-oriented stage. We apologize for that.
Thank you. My name is Berit Bryn Jensen, and I do not live in Oslo. I live in the southern part of Norway. And I am following Aaron Maté and Diesen and the rest of this excellent panel as best I can, since I'm a pensioner. So my time is free to use as I want. I thank you for your competence and your courage in standing up against this very unjust world we live in, and where Europe certainly is not what we were brought up to believe. And I missed a point in your conversation now, because it's focusing very much on North American continent. Germany is now aiming to become the greatest military power in Europe again. Norway, with our wealth, seems to be following suit. And that is not the way of peace. And the only thing we can do is to speak out against it. Because if we read history, we have seen these things before. And I'll stop now and say this morning I was listening to an American, I think he's American, historian, whose name is Richard Sakwa, who recently came out with a book about the peace we lost when the Soviet Union collapsed. And he said about President Trump that he is not a perfect vessel, but he can still be a vessel for good if he secures peace in Europe, in Ukraine. And what happens in Gaza, I do not know, as little as you do, but it is so horrible that I think that the very unjust and violent society in the Middle East, which has been waging war since before 1948 against the local population, I think they are so vile that they implode by itself. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll just say one thing about. Should I?
Yes, please, Aaron.
Just one point about Trump and peace. It's true. It's taken Trump to push for peace in Ukraine, and it looks like. I mean, he's certainly more serious about that than the Biden administration, which refused to even speak to Russia and was using Ukraine to bleed Russia. And it looks like Trump is basically walking away from this whole thing, which means ultimately Ukraine will have to reach a deal because it can't go on without the U.S. fueling the war. And actually, we recently learned from the New York Times that the U.S. was running the war, essentially, including choosing targets from a military base in Germany. But in terms of, so yes, so we might see an end to the Ukraine proxy war under Trump. But at the same time, Trump is pressuring Europe to increase their spending on the military to, I believe, 5% GDP, which will, further erode social welfare spending in Europe, which is, what made Europe so special, I think, around the world, and the envy of so many people around the world, certainly me. And so Trump will certainly continue to erode that agenda, erode the social welfare state in Europe. And Europe has put itself in this position by subordinating its security to U.S. hegemony, which is a decision I'll never understand, but that's the world we're in.
Yes, please go ahead.
My name is Trine Gunberg, and I'm in Sentralstyret in FOR. I have a question about the deep state. Nobody of you have talked about the deep state, and I would like you to talk a little about the deep state in this matter. Thank you.
Who would like to take that on first?
I think we all talked about it. What shall we say about the deep state? Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised it exists. It would be more surprising if it didn't exist. Like if you read the work of Edward Bernays, whom we referred to already, the guy who is considered the founding father of modern propaganda. He said in his book Propaganda, like, our democratic system doesn't work. Exactly the same as Lippmann said, the most influential journalist of the 20th century. He said the political democratic system doesn't work. The leaders are not the leaders anymore. The masses are the leaders, because it's not the leaders who impose their will to the masses, it's the masses who impose their will to the leaders in a democracy. And as the masses are always irrational and destructive, we will fall prey to the masses. And he said that's why we have to establish a government which rules from behind all the government. So that was someone like Bernays said, like, we literally have to establish a structure, a deep state, let's say, who manipulates constantly the population. And well, That's what they do, and the population doesn't care. That's the point. That's the problem. And we try to make them care.
I'll say about the deep state that I think nowhere have they been so destructive, at least in recent memory, as in Ukraine, where they sabotaged or went against the will of not just one President Trump, but also Obama as well. It was under Obama that France and Germany brokered the Minsk Accords, which was aimed at ending the fighting that began in Ukraine as a result of the 2014 coup. And the UN Security Council endorsed the Minsk Accords. But basically, you had a group of people working under Obama who completely ignored his own policy. And while he was trying to support Angela Merkel and François Hollande and backing up, or at least publicly he was, behind the scenes, people like Victoria Nuland, who was a very powerful person in the State Department, instrumental in the 2014 Maidan coup, she was the one caught on tape saying, F the EU, F-U-C-K, the EU, and basically choosing who would be in the next Ukrainian government, showing the key influence that the U.S. had over the Maidan leaders. So Victoria Nuland, there was actually a scene where, as the Minsk Accords were being signed back in February 2015, Victoria Nuland went to the Munich Security Conference and met on the sidelines with NATO officials, a general named Philip Breedlove. He was a NATO commander, and there was a group of American lawmakers too. And she basically said, "Forget the Minsk Accords. This is Merkel's Moscow thing," and she undermined what even her own president supported. And European officials reported at the time they were confused because Obama was telling them one thing, but Nuland was saying the other. But it speaks to the power of the deep state, the permanent state. It was the Nuland position that won. And then when Trump came in, the sabotage of peace in Ukraine went on steroids because they didn't just ignore his policies. They framed him as a Russian agent. And that incentivized him to show how tough he was and not a Russian agent, that incentivized him to then fuel the Ukraine proxy war even more. And even when he got out of line once and he froze weapons to Ukraine while pressuring Ukraine to investigate the origins of Russiagate and Biden, they impeached him for the first time, just to teach him a lesson. So it's just interesting how the deep state, the permanent state, whatever you want to call it, it goes after anybody that doesn't fall totally in line, and the impact is disastrous.
May I? No. Yeah. Oh, sorry, just one quick thing. No, you can. Well, on the deep state, again, I think most people would define it as the permanent bureaucracy. So bureaucracy takes on almost the policies of its own. I just want to have a quick comment on the Victoria Nuland, because I think she's a good representative of what's often referred to as the deep state. That is, her family also run this think tank called the Institute for the Study of War. Now, this is sounds very formal, sounds like it belongs in a university, but this is, again, it's financed by the American weapon industries, like many of the politicians and think tanks, and it's run by the family of Victoria Nuland, again, the main actor behind the coup in 2014 in Ukraine. And now it just happens that the most cited source across the West about the war in Ukraine is the Institute for the Study of War. Even here in Norway, thousands of times it's cited, but never once has a journalist said, well, who is this institute who we're citing, our main source when reporting on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine? Who is it? Well, it just happens to be the same lady who were handing out cookies in Kyiv and one of the top officials in the United States. She's also now, by the way, on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up by Reagan and the director of the CIA back in 1983 for the purpose of using, to filter the CIA through these so-called human rights organizations. Again, perfect institutions for propaganda. You sell all your politics as being simply battle for values. So there's no more great power competing interests. There's always values, and then this National Endowment for Democracy is now financing a lot of NGOs everywhere who continues to manipulate civil society, but also governments. Also, by the way, they finance the Helsinki Committee, which are not very fond of me. So thank you.
If I can share a personal example of this, just one personal example of this. A few years ago, The Guardian of London, the liberal newspaper Guardian, called me the biggest purveyor of disinformation on Syria. right? And what was their source? It was something called the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And what The Guardian didn't tell their audience was that that is funded by the State Department, by NATO, by all these Western billionaire oligarchs. And of course, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue didn't provide even one example of my alleged disinformation on Syria, but it doesn't matter. You get a fancy-sounding think tank to say something, you cite it as a credible source, and that's just deemed to be truth.
Can I add something to that? Reuters declared that they got their information on Syria of two sources. Watch out. The white helmets,
Yes.
which were like terrorists, literally, and Osjord, which was a guy in Britain that even didn't visit Syria, who provided them with all their information. He was sitting in Coventry, I think. Yeah. So that's where they got their information on Syria from, Reuters. Almost unbelievable. That's
Most cited source, actually.
Yeah.
Yes.
One thing on Syria, by the way, which I forgot to mention, so for years we heard Assad, chemical weapons. He used chemical weapons against his own people. That's why we have to impose murderous sanctions that deny people bread and fuel. That's why we have to have regime change. Chemical weapons. It's been now 5 months since Assad was overthrown. Where are the chemical weapons? They haven't found one trace of chemical weapons in Syria. They're not easy to hide. I mean, now they want to say that the Syrian government hid them in caves, which I don't know if you know how chemical weapons works, but you don't hide chemical weapons in caves. And what actually happened was Assad destroyed his chemical weapons over a decade ago under a deal brokered by Russia, which helped avoid U.S. military strikes, which was a big achievement in international diplomacy and for the OPCW, the world's top chemical weapons watchdog. And rather than celebrate that achievement and recognize it as a advance towards peace, the deep state, whatever you want to call them, has continued to accuse without evidence Syria of these chemical weapons attacks to justify military strikes. And that's why they had to, when OPCW whistleblowers came out and said, our investigation was censored, we actually found no evidence of a chemical attack by Assad. The whistleblowers had to be censored, and their story had to be completely ignored by corporate media because it just goes against the narrative. And now no one asks, where are the chemical weapons? The country is now ruled by an Al-Qaeda offshoot. You'd think if they actually believed there were chemical weapons there, we'd be going in to secure the chemical weapons, but they're not, because they're not there anymore, because all these allegations of chemical weapons were false, and they were propaganda to justify atrocities by us.
I think there were chemical weapons. And Hillary Clinton personally ordered them to deliver them to the rebels, who used them as a false flag against Assad. The videos are available. I can send them to you if you want. And the mail of Hillary Clinton is also available. So I think there were chemical weapons, but it was a false flag.
What I'm saying is, Assad did have chemical weapons. He did. He had a stockpile, but it was destroyed.
Yes.
And there were chemical, and actually, the first major incident where he's accused of using chemical weapons is Ghouta, August 2013. And that happens just as Assad has asked a team of UN inspectors to come, and they're on the ground. They've just arrived because he's asked them to investigate a chemical attack on his own soldiers. And then according to the narrative we're supposed to believe, right when UN weapons inspectors are on the ground, that he's invited, all of a sudden Assad decides to go and use chemical weapons himself. But yet that's the dominant narrative that people believe.
Thank you very much. I always hate being the official timekeeper here, but John, we've had hands up in this area.
We have a woman here.
We have many women here too, and someone who claims they're a woman. Okay, yes, please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Claudia Joachim. I am also part of FOR. I would like to challenge you a little bit on the economic, moral, and emotional aspect. Could you please say 7 Nobel laureates have spoken very positively about the basic unconditional income. Could this be part of a solution for lowering the power, I mean, what we're discussing today? Have you ever elaborated on the basic unconditional income possibilities for an economic reform globally, within the UN, under the UN, maybe? Thank you.
Who was that question addressed to? All of you.
Basic income.
Who would like to start?
15 years ago, I was very much in favor of this idea of a basic income, and now I just wonder, like, where will they steal the money first in order to give it to the people again? So I don't believe in it anymore. I think it will just be a tool. If they ever provide us with a basic income, it will be accompanied, I think, by a social credit system. That means they will first introduce the CBDCs, central bank digital coins, couple it, give everyone a basic income, and couple it to a social credit system. So I think, sadly enough, that's what they have in mind when they consider providing everyone with a basic income.
I would just say I'm not an expert on basic income, but I would say it's not going to do that much to deal with the power question, right? Which is capitalists have too much power. Billionaires, the wealthy, have too much power. It can alleviate some of it, but I mean, in some sense, I don't. You know more about the Norwegian system than I do, but there is greater social entitlements here, which in some sense would go in the direction of what we could call a basic income, access to, in Canada it's called unemployment insurance, welfare, whatever, an expansion of that. I'm supportive of that, but I would only put that as a small piece. I mean, it's fundamentally immoral to have people who have this level of power because they just so happen to have, they're the owner of that multinational, or they have $1 billion worth of stock in that company, or exactly how that manifests. So that we can't, get away from that. We want to, cripple the power of capitalists. We don't just want, everyone to have access to a bit more money in their bank account. There's a power element to it, and there's a global power element to it too. In terms of the global aspect to it, I think there should be a greater system within the UN structure of what in Canada we call provincial equal payments. I'm totally losing the word right now, where the wealthier provinces put money into the other provinces, right? So we have a certain degree of equality through the different provinces of the country. And I think some variation of that should exist in the global scale, right? Where there is the wealthier parts of the world, but not through quote unquote aid, as is currently, which is a totally manipulated entity to control, but with a better, sort of democratic oversight, or i.e., no conditions. And the Global South has put forward variations of that proposal going back historically, and so yeah.
Okay. If this question is short and the response is going to be short, we can get one more question in. Please.
Okay, so not a long story then. I'm joking, I didn't prepare that. I was wondering about Trump. And Trump's kind of now eventually large position in the international society, also in Norway. So I think for many countries, including Norway, it's a bit hard to reconcile that Trump, at least in my opinion, has obviously good opinions on certain particular and confined matters. For instance, the Ukraine war. On most other matters, however, he has ludicrous opinions. And at least ludicrous, his actions are ludicrous, for example, towards the Palestine issue, not to mention like how he exploits the working people in the United States. So what I was wondering was, how can we help like the majority of the population to reconcile the fact that some things that Trump has opinions on are really legitimate and actually very reasonable, while at the same time he has ludicrous opinions on the other hand. And I think Trump's position on these things kind of reflects how opinions in the majority of society is. But how to reconcile it? Because suddenly Trump, it's very easy to make him a scapegoat and say that his opinions on Ukraine is just as crazy as his opinions on all other matters. So how do we reconcile that? Thank you.
Okay, can we keep that? Short is a relative word. Please, Can you come back with something, Aaron?
Yeah, listen, you raise a great question. I think a problem is so many of our liberal, progressive politicians, they're all smug elitists. You know, like you look at like Macron or Keir Starmer, they're, you know, nobody can relate to them because you can just tell they're well educated, they come from privileged backgrounds, and they have a certain smug contempt for average people. Whereas Trump is great at pretending that he's like, you know, your average working man, even though he's also privileged. He's more privileged than they are probably. But so we need someone actually who comes from a genuine working class background, or at least has real understandings of the working class, and doesn't come from this sort of coastal elitist, well-educated background. We need better political leaders. The problem is when they come along, they get sabotaged. Jeremy Corbyn, you know, Claire Daly, Mick Wallace of the European Parliament had to deal with so much mudslinging. And, you know, in my own limited experience of dealing with defamation, it just takes up your time. So you don't have the time to do the things you want to do because you have to spend time defending yourself. Julian Assange, another person that this happened to. So much investment in clearing his name from all the false allegations. So Glenn Diesen also, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So we need to get whoever comes along, we need to get behind them and defend them, and because of course we're capable of producing people that can speak to genuine working people's concerns, because that's what we care about as progressive people, whatever you want to call it. But the question you raise is such a challenge, and it's a big one now because Trump is so good at exploiting the very real grievances that people have. And he talks about the neocons, and people love that because they brought us the Iraq War, and he calls them out. You know, he makes people think that he's on the side against the neocons, even though he's got neocons all around him. So you raise a critical question, and I hope we can succeed in the challenge that you pose.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Very quickly now, I have this event has started being planned a half a year ago. I'm very grateful for everyone who's come from 3 different countries to be here. 4. I always forget about Sweden. I do want to thank the 2 other people who have been involved in the organizing of this event, and I want them to stand up when I announce them. John Jones. And Tala Brenna. To echo back to something that was said at the beginning of this evening, I believe that we have all talked sincerely today. And that was the first step, is it not? Yeah. Here's to peace and justice.
We go to have dinner. We go to have dinner.